He played 150 consecutive nights at Madison Square Garden, 150 nights on the most famous stage in the world, 150 nights in the arena where Muhammad Ali fought, where the Knicks have played, where the Rolling Stones and Frank Sinatra and Elton John stood before the roaring crowds of New York City. 150 nights, not as a visiting act, not as a special event, but as a resident, a permanent fixture, a man so woven into the identity of that place that the arena itself seemed to breathe differently when he was in it. His name is Billy Joel. And at 77 years old, he is one of the greatest songwriters America has ever produced. Piano Man, The Stranger. It's still rock and roll to me. We didn't start the fire. These are not merely songs. They are monuments. They are the soundtrack of an entire generation's life. They are the music that played at weddings, at graduations, at funerals, at 2 a.m. in the kitchens of people who needed to feel less alone. Billy Joel did not write pop music. He wrote the emotional architecture of American life across 5 decades, and he did it from a piano bench, with his sleeves rolled up, with a voice that never pretended to be anything other than exactly what it was. But behind that unmatched legacy lies a story. Not glamorous, but quietly devastating. Because on May 23, 2025, a statement appeared on Billy Joel's official accounts. It was short. It was careful. It used clinical language and measured sentences. And in the space of a few paragraphs, it told the world that the man who had given 150 consecutive nights to Madison Square Garden could no longer perform. That his brain, the brain that had carried every chord, every lyric, every arrangement across more than 50 years of music, was fighting a condition that had, in the months leading up to that statement, taken from him the very capabilities that made performance possible. The condition had a name: normal pressure hydrocephalus, a neurological diagnosis, a buildup of fluid in the ventricles of the brain, pressing against the tissue that governs movement, balance, and clarity of thought. And here is the question that this story demands you sit with from the very beginning. What happens to a musician when the instrument he cannot replace is his own mind? If Billy Joel's music has ever found you in the moments when you needed it most, if Piano Man ever played when you were far from home, if The Stranger ever made you feel understood, leave a tribute in the comments. Because this is not just a health update. This is the story of what it costs to give everything to the world, and what remains when the world asks for more than a body can give. It is remarkable when a man builds one of the greatest careers in American music history, not in spite of hardship, but precisely because of it. And to understand what is happening to Billy Joel today, you have to go back to where it all began. Not to the stage, not to the record label, not to Madison Square Garden, but to a small house in Hicksville, Long Island, in the years after the Second World War, where a boy sat alone at a piano and began to play. William Martin Joel was born on May 9, 1949, in the Bronx, New York, but it was Long Island that made him. Specifically, it was Hicksville, a small, unremarkable post-war suburb on the western edge of Nassau County, where the houses were modest, the streets were quiet, and the expectations for the children who grew up there were measured and practical. You got a trade. You got a job. You did not become one of the most successful musicians in the history of American popular music. That was not what Hicksville was for. And yet, his father, Howard Joel, born Helmut Joel, was not a typical Long Island man. He was a classically trained pianist who had studied at the conservatory in Frankfurt before the rise of National Socialism forced his family to flee Germany. Howard Joel survived the war. He came to America. He built a life. And then, sometime in the middle of the 1950s, when Billy was still small enough to sit at the piano bench without his feet reaching the floor, Howard Joel left. He packed his things and he moved to Vienna, leaving behind a wife, a son, and a daughter in a house in Hicksville that suddenly had to reorganize itself around an absence that no one had asked for. Billy Joel was 7 years old when his father left. That fact matters, not as a wound to be displayed. Billy Joel himself has spoken about it with more curiosity than bitterness in the decades since, but as a structural fact about the kind of boy he became. The father who left was a musician. The mother who stayed was not. And yet, the piano remained in the house. And the boy kept playing. His mother, Rosalind Neiman Joel, enrolled him in piano lessons when he was 4 years old. His teacher was a woman named Mrs. Francis, a local instructor who recognized early that the boy had something beyond ordinary aptitude. He had an ear. He had retention. He could hear a piece of music and reconstruct it from memory with a fidelity that went far beyond what could be taught. By the time he was a teenager, Billy Joel was playing in local bands around Long Island. Not as a hobby, not as a dream, but as a necessity. The family needed money. His mother worked. His father sent what support he could from Europe, which was never enough. And so Billy Joel played. He attended Hicksville High School, but never graduated. The reason was not indifference. It was arithmetic. He had been playing so many late-night gigs with a band called the Echoes, and later with the Hassles, that by the time graduation came, he did not have enough daytime hours logged to qualify for a diploma. He made up the credits years later, and the school awarded him an honorary diploma in 1992. But in the late 1960s, he was simply a young man from Long Island with no degree, a second-hand piano, and an absolute refusal to pursue any life that did not involve music. He later recalled in interviews that in those early years, the idea of a formal career in music seemed genuinely unlikely. The industry was not looking for a kid from Hicksville with no connections and no conservatory training. What Billy Joel had instead was something that cannot be taught and cannot be bought. An instinct for the emotional truth inside a song. He did not write academic music. He did not write art music designed to impress other musicians. He wrote music that found people where they were and told them they were not alone. That instinct, forged in a house where a father's absence sat quietly in every room, where money was thin and the future was uncertain, is the foundation on which everything else was built. He was not supposed to conquer anything. He was a working-class kid from a broken home in a suburb that history was not watching. And that, precisely that, is what made what came next so extraordinary. There is a version of Billy Joel's story where none of it happens, where the young man from Hicksville, having failed to break through with the Hassles, and then with a short-lived duo called Attila, simply accepts the verdict of an industry that has already said no, where the piano player who recorded his first solo album, Cold Spring Harbor, released in 1971, accepts that a botched mastering job that made his voice sound unnaturally high and thin is simply the kind of thing that happens to people like him. Where he does not drive across the country to Los Angeles, does not spend 6 months playing piano under an assumed name at a bar called the Executive Room in Hollywood, does not send a demo tape to Columbia Records that catches the attention of producer Michael Stewart and executive Clive Davis. But that version of the story is not the one that happened. Billy Joel drove to Los Angeles. He played the Executive Room for 6 months under the name Bill Martin, because he was still technically under contract to a label he was trying to escape. He recorded the demo. He sent it. and in 1972, Columbia Records signed him. The album that followed was Piano Man, released in November of 1973. The title track was drawn directly from his time at the executive room. The bartender named John, who really did talk to him, the waitress practicing politics, the real estate novelist, the old man sitting next to him, making love to his tonic and gin. Billy Joel did not invent these people. He observed them, and then he gave them a song, and then the song gave them to the world. Piano Man reached number 25 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was not a number one record. By the commercial standards of the industry, it was a modest success. But something else happened with Piano Man that the charts could not fully measure. It became one of those rare songs that people claimed personally, that people sang at closing time in bars they would never return to, that people played at the funerals of fathers they had never entirely understood. The years that followed were not an unbroken ascent. The Stranger, released in 1977, was the album that changed everything structurally. Produced by Phil Ramone, it became the best-selling album in Columbia Records history at the time, surpassing the previous record held by Simon & Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. It contained Just the Way You Are, which won 2 Grammy Awards, Record of the Year and Song of the Year, at the 1979 ceremony. It contained Scenes from an Italian Restaurant, which at 7 minutes and 37 seconds was essentially a suite in 3 movements disguised as a pop song. The Stranger sold over 10 million copies in the United States alone. Glass Houses followed in 1980 and reached number 1 on the Billboard 200. It produced It's Still Rock and Roll to Me, which became Billy Joel's first number 1 single on the Hot 100. An Innocent Man arrived in 1983, a deliberate love letter to the rhythm and blues and doo-wop music of his Long Island childhood, and it produced 4 top 10 singles including Uptown Girl and Tell Her About It. By the middle of the 1980s, Billy Joel had won 6 Grammy Awards. He had sold tens of millions of records across multiple continents. He had sold out arenas in the United States, in Europe, in the Soviet Union, becoming, in 1987, one of the first Western rock artists to perform in the USSR, playing 3 concerts in Leningrad and Moscow that were later released as a live album. And through all of it, he sat at the piano. Not the guitar, not behind a microphone stand with a band arranged behind him. At the piano, the instrument his father had left behind in a house in Hicksville, the instrument his mother had enrolled him to study at the age of 4, the instrument that had been his companion through every version of his life. The piano was not a prop. It was not a signature affectation. It was the place where Billy Joel actually lived. He released The Nylon Curtain in 1982, which many critics consider his most ambitious work. A record that engaged directly with Vietnam, unemployment, and the fracturing of the American working-class dream in a way that pop music rarely attempted. He released Stormfront in 1989, which produced We Didn't Start the Fire, a rapid-fire historical catalog that reached number 1 and became, in the years since, one of the most immediately recognizable songs in the American cultural inventory. He released River of Dreams in 1993, which debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 and contained the title track, a song about searching for something you cannot name, in a place you cannot quite reach. After River of Dreams, Billy Joel made a decision that very few artists at his level of commercial success have ever made. He stopped recording pop music entirely. He announced that he had said what he needed to say in that form, and he turned his attention to classical composition. He released Fantasies and Delusions in 2001, an album of solo piano classical pieces performed by pianist Richard Jew, written by Billy Joel, played by someone else because Joel did not consider himself a concert-level classical pianist. It was a gesture of genuine humility from a man who had every reason to believe the opposite about himself. 6 Grammy Awards, 2 Grammy Lifetime Achievement Awards, induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1999, in his first year of eligibility, the best-selling albums list, the residency records, the sold-out arenas across 6 decades. But behind every number, behind every award, behind every sold-out night, there was something the industry does not measure. There was a boy from Hicksville at a piano bench, playing the only language he had ever fully trusted. And the question that no award can answer, the question that January 2026 would begin, quietly, to raise is what remains of a musician when the instrument he cannot replace begins to fail him from the inside. There is a number that defines the final chapter of Billy Joel's performing life more completely than any other. Not the Grammy count, not the album sales, not the decades on the road. The number is 150. 150 consecutive monthly residency concerts at Madison Square Garden in New York City, the most famous indoor arena on the planet. 150 nights in a building that has hosted more significant events in the history of American sport and entertainment than perhaps any other structure ever built. 150 nights as a resident, as a fixture, as the man the Garden called home. It began in January of 2014. The concept was simple in the way that genuinely audacious ideas always appear simple in retrospect. Billy Joel would play Madison Square Garden once a month, every month, for as long as the demand existed. No fixed end date, no pre-announced final night. Just a man and a piano and an arena, month after month, for as long as New York wanted him there. The promoters and the venue had reservations. A monthly residency of that scale, sustained indefinitely, was something that had never been attempted at Madison Square Garden. The conventional wisdom said that demand would plateau, that audiences would thin, that the novelty would wear away within a year. The conventional wisdom was wrong. Every single one of those 150 shows sold out. Every one. In an era when the recorded music industry had been fundamentally disrupted, when streaming had collapsed album revenue, when artists were being told that the concert tour was the only remaining reliable income source, Billy Joel demonstrated something that the industry had half forgotten. That genuine, deep, decades-long connection between an artist and an audience is not a finite resource. That people do not tire of the songs that have lived with them through the most significant moments of their lives. That piano man played live, in the room, with the crowd singing every word in unison, is not a product that ages. It is a ritual. And rituals do not become obsolete. He played with orchestras. He played with guest artists. Paul McCartney appeared on that stage, and Bruce Springsteen, and Axl Rose, and Garth Brooks, and Tony Bennett, in what would be one of Bennett's final major public performances before his own health decline. He played in the aftermath of personal loss and in the middle of private joys. He played through the ordinary deteriorations that accumulate in a body that has spent more than 5 decades on the road. The hearing loss that he has spoken about publicly, the knee that had required surgery, the back that carries the accumulated weight of 10,000 performances. He played anyway. Because that is what Billy Joel does. That is what he has always done. And then, in the months leading into early 2025, something began to shift. The people closest to him, his team, the musicians who had played beside him for years, the crew who had built and broken down that stage 150 times, began to notice changes. Not dramatic, not sudden, but consistent. Problems with balance during performances. A quality to his movement on stage that was different from the ordinary stiffness of age. different from the familiar adjustments a 77-year-old body makes when it has been asked to perform at that level for that long. Something was happening that was not simple fatigue and not the ordinary mathematics of a body in its late 70s. The last complete concert of the Madison Square Garden residency, the last full performance Billy Joel gave, took place in February of 2025. And sometime during those final weeks of performing, he fell on stage. The details of the fall were not widely circulated. His team did not release footage. The precise concert, the precise moment, were kept from public documentation in the way that his team has always managed the private details of his health. With discretion, with care, with a protective instinct that speaks to genuine loyalty rather than mere image management. But the fall happened, and the people who were there understood. In the way that people understand things, they are not yet ready to say out loud that something had changed, that the residency that had seemed as though it might simply continue indefinitely, 150 nights becoming 200, becoming 250, had reached a boundary it could not cross. 3 months later, on May 23, 2025, the statement appeared on his official Instagram account, and the word that the statement contained, the clinical, specific, neurological word, gave a name to what his body had been quietly signaling for months: normal pressure hydrocephalus. 3 words that most of the people who read that statement had never encountered before. 3 words that his audience, the 55-year-olds, the 65-year-olds, the 70-year-olds who had been singing Piano Man since 1973, read on their phones and their tablets and their laptops with a kind of stillness that is different from ordinary shock. Because this audience knows, in a way that younger audiences do not yet fully know, what it means when a body of that age receives a neurological diagnosis. They have watched parents receive those diagnoses. They have sat in those consultation rooms. They have heard doctors use careful, measured language to describe conditions that reorganize everything. The statement was careful to include what hope there was to include. It described the condition. It described the treatment options. It described the specific physical therapy that Joel had already begun. And it ended with a sentence from his wife, Alexis Roderick, that carried in its plainness more weight than any dramatic declaration could have managed. We are hopeful for his recovery. Hopeful. Not certain. Not guaranteed. Hopeful. That is an honest word. And Billy Joel, across 50 years of songwriting, has always been an honest man. Most people who read the words normal pressure hydrocephalus on May 23, 2025, had never heard them before. That is not a failure of education. It is simply a reflection of how medicine works. Conditions exist in the world, affecting real people in significant numbers, and they remain invisible to the general public until someone whose name the general public knows receives a diagnosis. Billy Joel's diagnosis did something that no medical awareness campaign had managed to do with the same speed or reach. It put those 3 words, normal pressure hydrocephalus, in front of millions of people simultaneously, in every time zone, on every platform, in every language. And because those millions of people care about Billy Joel, they did something they might not have done for a clinical term they encountered in a health article. They looked it up. They read. They tried to understand. What they found is a condition that is, in equal measure, serious and this word matters enormously, treatable. Normal pressure. Hydrocephalus is a neurological condition caused by the abnormal accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles are the fluid-filled chambers that sit at the center of the brain's architecture. They exist in every healthy brain, and the fluid that moves through them, cerebrospinal fluid, serves a vital protective and nutritive function. In a healthy system, that fluid is produced, circulates through the brain and spinal cord, and is reabsorbed at a rate that keeps the total volume in balance. In normal pressure hydrocephalus, that reabsorption process is disrupted. Fluid accumulates, the ventricles expand, and as they expand, they press outward against the surrounding brain tissue. Gently, persistently, not with the dramatic sudden pressure of an acute injury, but with a slow, continuous compression that interferes with the neural pathways that run through and around those structures. The pressure, paradoxically, remains within what imaging studies classify as normal range, which is precisely where the condition gets its name, and precisely why it is so frequently misdiagnosed. The fluid is accumulating, the ventricles are enlarged, the symptoms are progressing, and yet the pressure readings taken in isolation do not show the dramatic elevation that would immediately signal a crisis. This is the diagnostic trap that has caused normal pressure hydrocephalus to be missed or misattributed in thousands of patients before the condition is correctly identified. The symptoms form what neurologists call a classic triad. 3 presentations occurring together that in combination point toward this specific diagnosis with a clarity that no single symptom alone provides. The first is gait disturbance. Not simply unsteadiness, a specific characteristic disruption to the mechanics of walking that clinicians sometimes describe as magnetic gait, because the patient moves as though their feet are attached to the floor. The steps become short and shuffling. The ability to lift the feet fully, to stride with the normal fluidity of movement that a healthy body produces without conscious effort, is compromised. The person appears to be walking through resistance that no one else in the room can see or feel. The second is cognitive impairment, a slowing of thought, difficulty with processing speed, with memory retrieval, with the kind of rapid, flexible thinking that allows a person to hold multiple ideas simultaneously and move between them. This cognitive presentation is one of the primary reasons normal pressure hydrocephalus is so frequently misdiagnosed, because its cognitive symptoms overlap significantly with the early presentations of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, 2 conditions that exist in far greater public awareness, and that physicians may reach for first when an older patient presents with this particular constellation of complaints. The third is urinary incontinence, a symptom that patients and families often find difficult to report, and that therefore frequently delays diagnosis further. In Billy Joel's case, the public statement focused specifically on 3 affected domains: hearing, vision, and balance. His team noted that recent concert performances had exacerbated the condition and had led to these specific problems. The gait disturbance that manifests as balance difficulty during performance, the difficulty holding a stable physical position on a stage, the coordination challenges that a performance environment intensifies, fits precisely within the documented symptom profile of normal pressure hydrocephalus in a patient who is asking their body to do something as physically demanding as a full concert performance. Now, here is where the story of this condition diverges from the story of the other neurological diagnoses that his audience may have encountered in the people they love. Normal pressure hydrocephalus is frequently described in neurology as the treatable dementia, not because every case resolves completely, not because every patient who receives the diagnosis will experience a full return to their prior baseline, but because, unlike Alzheimer's disease, unlike the primary progressive dementias that have no intervention capable of reversing their course, normal pressure hydrocephalus has a standard surgical treatment that produces genuine, measurable, significant improvement in a meaningful proportion of patients who receive it. That treatment is the implantation of a ventriculoperitoneal shunt, a small, precisely engineered device that is placed surgically, with one end positioned in the ventricle of the brain where the excess fluid has accumulated, and the other end routed through the body to the peritoneal cavity of the abdomen, where the drained fluid is safely reabsorbed. The shunt operates continuously, drawing off the excess cerebrospinal fluid that the brain's own reabsorption mechanism is failing to clear, and maintaining the ventricular volume within a range that relieves the compression on the surrounding neural tissue. The results, in patients who are good candidates for the procedure and who receive it at an appropriate stage of their condition, can be striking. Gait improves. Cognitive clarity returns. The symptoms that had accumulated gradually over months or years begin, in many cases, to recede at a rate that patients and their families describe not as gradual improvement, but as a kind of return, as though the person who had been slowly disappearing behind the symptoms is re-emerging. Billy Joel's team did not confirm publicly whether he had undergone shunt surgery. What was confirmed was that he had begun a course of specific physical therapy designed for normal pressure hydrocephalus, a therapy regimen that focuses on gait retraining, balance rehabilitation, and the rebuilding of the coordination pathways that the condition had disrupted. Physical therapy alone cannot drain the accumulated fluid, but it can, in combination with appropriate medical management, support the neurological system's capacity to compensate and to recover function within the boundaries of what remains possible. And in July of 2025, in a conversation that reached far beyond the audience of any single podcast, Billy Joel told the world, in his own words, in his own voice, exactly where things stood. What were those words, and what did they reveal about what was actually happening inside a recovery that the world was watching from a careful distance? There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It is not the courage of the stage. The courage that Billy Joel has demonstrated 150 times at Madison Square Garden, walking out in front of 20,000 people and playing for 3 hours without a set list, trusting the room and trusting himself to find the right song at the right moment. That courage is real, but it is also a courage that has an audience, a spotlight, a roar of recognition that meets it and sustains it. The courage that Billy Joel demonstrated in July of 2025 was quieter. It was the courage of a man who could have said nothing, who had every professional and personal reason to manage his public image with carefully worded statements and strategic silence, choosing instead to sit across from a podcast host and speak plainly about a recovery that was not finished. The podcast was Club Random, hosted by Bill Maher. It is not a music industry production. It is not a format designed to generate sympathetic coverage. Bill Maher's conversational style is direct, and the guests who appear on Club Random understand that directness is the price of admission. Billy Joel appeared in July of 2025, several months into his recovery from the normal pressure hydrocephalus diagnosis, and he said two things that the world needed to hear, and that the world, in many cases, was not entirely prepared for. The first thing he said was that he was okay. "I know a lot of people are worried about me and my health," he told Maher, "but I'm okay." Those words traveled across every platform within hours of the episode's release. They were the words his audience had been waiting for since May 23rd. They were the confirmation that the man himself was present, was communicative, was capable of sitting in a room and having a real conversation about what was happening to him. For an audience that had spent months reading clinical statements and secondhand reports, hearing Billy Joel's voice saying, "I'm okay," carried a weight that no press release could have replicated. But the second thing he said was equally important, and it was harder to hear. "It's not fixed." 3 words. The same economy of language that has always characterized his best songwriting. The refusal to use more syllables than the truth requires. It's not fixed. Not, it's getting better every day. Not the doctors are optimistic, and we expect a full recovery. Not any of the formulations that a publicist might have preferred. Just the plain, unadorned, respectful truth. The condition was ongoing. The recovery was real but incomplete. The man who had given the world 50 years of honesty in song was not going to begin managing the narrative of his own illness with the language of false reassurance. This matters beyond the personal. It matters because Billy Joel's audience, the generation that grew up with Piano Man and The Stranger in Glass Houses, is the generation that is currently navigating, in their own lives and in the lives of the people they love, exactly the kinds of diagnoses that he was describing. They are the generation sitting in neurologists' offices, translating clinical language for aging parents, learning the difference between conditions that are manageable and conditions that are not. When Billy Joel said it's not fixed, he was not being pessimistic. He was being precise. And that precision was, for many people in that audience, more useful than optimism would have been. Because it's not fixed does not mean it cannot improve. It does not mean the trajectory is downward. It means that normal pressure hydrocephalus, like most serious neurological conditions in patients in their late 70s, is a condition that is managed over time, that responds to treatment at its own pace, that requires sustained physical therapy and medical monitoring and the kind of patient, incremental work that does not produce the clean narrative arc that a dramatic recovery story would prefer. The physical therapy that Billy Joel had been undertaking since the diagnosis was specifically designed for the symptom profile of normal pressure hydrocephalus. The focus was on gait retraining, rebuilding the neural pathways that govern the mechanics of walking, the lift of the foot, the length of the stride, the coordination between the lower body and the balance systems of the inner ear and the cerebellum. It was on balance rehabilitation, the slow, repetitive work of standing and shifting and moving in controlled environments until the body's compensatory systems begin to re-establish the stability that the accumulated fluid had undermined. And it was on coordination, the precise, demanding work of asking a nervous system that has been operating under compression to relearn the fluid, automatic movements that healthy bodies perform without conscious direction. This is not glamorous work. It does not happen in front of audiences. There are no sold-out nights, no encores, no roar of 20,000 voices singing the chorus back at you. There is a therapist and a set of exercises and a body that is being asked, patiently and repeatedly, to remember what it once knew how to do without thinking. Billy Joel did that work, quietly, away from the cameras, through the summer and autumn of 2025, while his audience waited and hoped and marked the calendar against the dates of the concerts that had been canceled, the tour with Rod Stewart, with Sting, with Stevie Nicks, the dates that had been announced and then withdrawn as the recovery continued at its own pace and on its own terms. And then, on the second day of January 2026, something happened that nobody had been told to expect. Not a press release, not a carefully managed announcement, not the kind of return that gets choreographed weeks in advance and leaked to the entertainment press to build anticipation. Something entirely different. Something that, in its smallness and its spontaneity and its complete absence of calculation, said more about who Billy Joel actually is than any of the 150 Madison Square Garden nights ever could. He walked onto a small stage in Florida, and he picked up a microphone, and he said, "I wasn't planning on working tonight." Nobody told the crowd at the village of Wellington's 30th anniversary celebration to expect Billy Joel. Wellington is not Madison Square Garden. It is not an arena with 20,000 seats and a history that stretches back through Muhammad Ali and the Knicks and Frank Sinatra. It is a planned community in Palm Beach County, Florida, a village of equestrian estates and suburban streets, and the kind of quiet, unhurried life that people build when they have decided that the noise of the larger world is no longer what they need. It is the kind of place where a January evening community celebration happens outdoors, with a tribute band on a modest stage and families gathered in the warm Florida night to mark an anniversary that matters to them and to nobody else in particular. The tribute band was called Turnstiles. They play exclusively the music of Billy Joel. Every song, every arrangement, every note of a catalog that spans 5 decades and contains more immediately recognizable melodies than almost any other single artist in American popular music history. They are good at what they do. They have built an audience of people who love Billy Joel's music and who want to experience it live in a room, with a band, with the songs played the way the songs were meant to be played. On the night of January 2nd, 2026, they were doing exactly that, playing for a crowd gathered to celebrate 30 years of a village that most of the world has never heard of. And then the announcement came from the stage. A special guest was going to appear. The crowd did not know what that meant. Special guests at tribute band concerts occupy a wide spectrum. A local musician, a regional personality, someone tangentially connected to the music being performed. The crowd was warm and receptive, and they applauded, because crowds at outdoor community celebrations in Florida on January evenings are warm and receptive, and they waited to see what the announcement meant. What it meant was Billy Joel. He walked onto that stage accompanied by his wife, Alexis Roderick, and by his 2 daughters, Della Rose and Remy Ann, the children he and Alexis had welcomed in 2015 and 2017, the girls who have grown up in a household where one of the most celebrated catalogs in American music history was simply what their father did. He walked onto a stage that was smaller than anything he had stood on in the previous decade. He walked onto a stage with no production, no lighting rig, no sound design engineered for a 20,000-seat arena. He walked onto a stage in a village in Florida, in front of a crowd that had not paid for a Billy Joel concert and had not expected one, and he asked permission to use the microphone. And then he sang. He sang "We Didn't Start the Fire," the rapid-fire historical catalog that has been one of the most recognizable songs in the American cultural inventory since it reached #1 in 1989. And he sang "Big Shot," the sharp driving track from 1978, one of the songs that demonstrated early in his career that Billy Joel's range extended far beyond the elegiac intimacy of Piano Man into something harder and more confrontational. He sang while his daughters danced beside him on the stage. He sang in front of a crowd that had gathered for a community anniversary and found themselves, without warning, inside one of the most quietly significant moments in the story of one of the greatest musicians America has ever produced. And he said, to the crowd that was now roaring around him in the warm Florida night, "I wasn't planning on working tonight." 7 words. The same precision, the same compression, the same instinct for the line that carries exactly the right weight. No more, no less, that has defined his songwriting across half a century. "I wasn't planning on working tonight." It is a throwaway line. It is the kind of thing a performer says to a crowd to be charming and self-deprecating and to acknowledge the spontaneity of the moment. And it is also read in the context of everything that had preceded it. The diagnosis, the canceled concerts, the physical therapy, the podcast admission that it wasn't fixed, the months of quiet work away from every stage in the world. One of the most significant sentences Billy Joel has spoken in public in years. Because what the sentence actually said, beneath its casual surface, was this: "I am here." I walked onto a stage. I picked up a microphone. I sang. My daughters were beside me. The crowd sang back, and none of it was planned, which means all of it was real. The appearance was covered by entertainment media across America as an encouraging sign of progress. And it was that. But it was also something more than a health update data point, more than evidence to be logged in the ongoing story of his recovery. It was Billy Joel being, in the most unguarded and unrehearsed way possible, exactly who he has always been. A man who plays. A man for whom the stage is not a workplace, but a home. A place he returns to, not because a contract requires it, but because something in him requires it. Something that was formed in a house in Hicksville when he was 4 years old, and his mother enrolled him in piano lessons, and he sat down at the bench and discovered that the language he had been looking for had been there all along, waiting for him in the keys. He is 77 years old. His brain is fighting a condition that attacked the very capabilities that made 150 consecutive nights at Madison Square Garden possible. He has told the world, in his own voice, that it is not fixed. And he walked onto a small stage in Florida on the second night of a new year, with his wife and his daughters beside him, and he sang to a crowd that had not expected him, and he was, by every account of everyone who was there, fully, completely, unmistakably present. That is not a recovery story with a clean ending. It is something more honest than that, and something more valuable. It is the story of a man who has spent his entire life telling the truth in song, about loneliness, about love, about the weight of time and the persistence of hope, and who is now, in the most personal chapter of his life, telling the truth the same way he always has, without ornament, without false comfort, with the plain, undefended, quietly courageous honesty that has made his music matter to so many people for so long. What does it mean to give everything to a craft across an entire lifetime? What does it mean to face a condition that threatens the very instrument of that craft? Not a guitar that can be replaced, not a voice that can be wrested, but the brain itself, the irreplaceable seat of every song he has ever written. And to keep showing up anyway? To sit in the physical therapy room and do the work? To appear on a podcast and say, "It's not fixed," when an easier answer was available? To walk onto a small stage in Florida, unannounced, because a stage was there and the music was playing, and something in him simply could not stay in the audience. If this story has moved you, if Piano Man has ever played at a moment in your life when you needed exactly what it offered, leave a tribute in the comments for Billy Joel, 77 years old, still showing up, still singing. And if you want to be here for the stories that matter, the lives behind the music, the people behind the headlines, the truth behind the legend, subscribe to Golden Fame News. Because this is what we do here. We tell the whole story.